Welcome back to the channel, and if this is your first time here, you have chosen the perfect story to start with. Because what you are about to experience is not just a romance, it is a complete transformation of everything you think you know about power, worth, and what it truly means to be seen. Before we dive in, hit that like button and make sure you are subscribed, because we release new supernatural romance stories every week, and you do not want to miss a single one. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let the snow begin to fall, because this story starts in the coldest night of the year and ends with a fire that will warm you long after the final word. The village of Ashevale sat at the foot of the Stoneback Mountains like a forgotten child pressed against the knee of a giant who had stopped paying attention. It was not on any official map of the Five Clans territory, not because it did not exist, but because the people who drew maps had decided long ago that places populated primarily by omegas and unmated betas without clan standing were not worth the ink. The village had no pack house, no alpha council representative, no monthly grain allocation from the regional distribution center. What it had was a single well that froze every winter, a market that operated 3 days a week selling goods that the larger towns had already rejected, and approximately 200 residents who had learned to ask nothing from the system that had already told them, in every possible way, that they did not matter. Lena Ashwood had lived in Ashevale for 6 years, which meant she had lived there long enough to stop being angry about it and start being practical. She was 24 years old, an Omega without a presenting clan mark, which in the language of the 5 clans meant she was classified as unaffiliated, which in the language of actual daily life meant she paid higher taxes, received no clan protections, and was legally forbidden from purchasing property within any of the 5 recognized territories. The caseburg she lived in, a single-room structure with walls that let in wind through gaps she had stuffed with wool and dried moss, technically belonged to Elder Marin, a beta woman in her 70s who charged Lena 14 silver marks a month and had never once fixed the roof. Lena paid it without complaint because the alternative was sleeping in the market stalls, and she had done that once in her first week in Ashevale and had decided she would rather work herself to the bone than do it again. Her work was divided between 3 occupations that together barely constituted 1 living wage. 3 days a week she washed linens for the families who could afford to pay someone else to do it, carrying bundles to the frozen river at the edge of town where a heated washhouse had been built by community effort 7 years before she arrived. 2 days a week she collected herbs from the mountain foothills, plants that healers in the larger town, Avoreth, would purchase for their apothecaries, dried bundles of feverwort and cold bloom, and the pale silver mushrooms that grew only in sheltered rock crevices and had no official name, but which every herbalist in 100 miles knew to value. On Sundays she mended clothes, a skill she had taught herself with a borrowed needle and leftover thread, and which now provided a small but steady trickle of coin from villagers who could not afford new garments, but needed their existing ones to last another season. It was not a comfortable life, but it was hers, and she had built it with her own hands. And on the nights when the wind screamed through the mountain pass, and she sat close to her small fire with a cup of weak tea, she sometimes felt something that was not quite peace, but was adjacent to it, the particular satisfaction of a person who has survived something that was supposed to break them. The night everything changed began the way the worst nights always do, quietly, with snow. Lena had returned from a late collection run, her basket lighter than she had hoped, because the cold had driven most of the herbs into dormancy earlier than expected this year. She had enough feverwort to sell a small bundle, not enough to cover the gap she knew was coming at the end of the month. She was doing the arithmetic in her head as she pushed open her door, the familiar calculation of what could be stretched and what could be skipped, when the smell hit her. It was not a smell she could have named precisely, because she had never encountered anything like it. Rich and dark and layered, like pine resin and winter stone, and something older beneath both. Something that made the small, instinctive part of her brain that she usually kept very carefully quiet sit up and pay sudden, sharp attention. She froze in the doorway for a moment, confused, because her cabin was empty, and she had locked the door, and there was no reason for that scent to be inside. Then she realized it was not Inside. It was coming from outside, from the direction of the wood line 20 feet behind her cabin, carried on the wind that had just shifted from the north. She should have gone inside. Every sensible instinct she had developed in 6 years of surviving alone told her to close the door, bank the fire, and pretend she had not smelled anything. Wolves in distress were dangerous. Strangers in the dark were dangerous. The combination of both was the kind of situation that the older women in Asheville had warned her about in her first months there, with the particular weary authority of people who had learned their lessons the hard way. Lena set down her basket, picked up the iron poker she kept by the door, and walked toward the wood line. She found him 15 feet into the trees, half buried in a snowdrift that had formed against the roots of an old pine. He was large, which was the first thing she registered, the kind of large that suggested alpha biology, even through the bulk of a cloak that was completely inadequate for this temperature. The cloak was dark, no clan markings visible, and beneath it, he wore clothing that was better quality than anything in Asheville, but torn in ways that were not accidental. There was blood on the left side of his torso, dark against the pale fabric of his shirt, and his face, half turned against the snow, was the color of cold wax. He was breathing. Barely, but breathing. Lena stood there for 3 seconds, poker in hand, looking at him. Then she put the poker against the tree, bent down, and began the extremely difficult process of getting a man who outweighed her by at least 80 pounds upright and moving. It took her the better part of 20 minutes to get him inside, and she was not gentle about it, because she could not afford to be gentle. She needed leverage and momentum, and the ruthless pragmatism of someone who understood that sentiment was a luxury for people who were not trying to prevent a stranger from dying of hypothermia in their backyard. He regained partial consciousness twice during the process, enough to take a few stumbling steps when she positioned his arm over her shoulders and urged him forward, his weight nearly buckling her knees. His breathing ragged and wet in a way that frightened her more than the blood. She got him onto her sleeping pallet, which was the only furniture in her cabin that could accommodate his size. And she did not think about the fact that it was her only pallet, or that she would be sleeping on the floor. She built the fire up as high as she dared, stripped his cloak and outer clothing with practiced efficiency, assessed the wound in his side with the same calm she used when she found injured animals in the foothills, and went to her medicine shelf. Her medicine shelf was where most of her herb money went, because Lena had learned in her first winter in Asheville that the nearest healer was 4 hours away on a good road in good weather, and that the ability to treat yourself was worth more than almost anything else you could own. She had dried feverwort, which reduced fever. She had cold bloom tincture, which prevented infection when applied to wounds. She had a small jar of rendered fat mixed with pine resin that served as a drawing salve. She had clean cloth strips she kept specifically for bandaging, and she had, in the very back of the shelf behind everything else, a small bundle of silver root, the most powerful healing herb she knew of, which she had been saving for 3 months because she could not quite bring herself to sell it. She used all of it. The wound was deep, but had missed anything vital. A blade injury, clean-edged, which told her it had been a deliberate attack rather than an accident. She cleaned it, packed it with the salve, bound it tightly, and then turned her attention to his fever, which was high enough to be dangerous. She boiled water, steeped the feverwort until the liquid was almost black, cooled it enough to be drinkable, and spent the next hour and a half getting small amounts of it into him between his periods of delirium. He spoke during the fever, fragments of sentences that made no complete sense, names she did not recognize, commands that came out in the authoritative cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed even while barely conscious. He said, "the council" twice with a tone of such cold fury that it made the hair on Lena's arms rise. He said a name, Davan, with an emotion she could not parse, somewhere between grief and rage. And once, near the worst of the fever, he reached out and gripped her wrist with a strength that shocked her given how ill he was, and said very clearly, "Do not let them change the record." "I won't," she said, because it seemed like the right thing to say, and because his grip loosened when she said it, and because she had learned that sometimes the most useful thing you could do for a delirious person was simply agree. by the time the fever broke. Near dawn, Lena had used her last measure of tea, her last piece of firewood from the indoor stack, and eaten nothing since a small meal at midday the previous day. She was sitting on the floor beside the pallet with her back against the wall, and her eyes at the specific, unfocused angle of someone who is too tired to sleep, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, and listening to the storm outside begin, finally, to quiet. She had one item left in her food stores that she had been saving for the end of the week when she was not sure if she would be able to make market. A single portion of dense grain porridge, the kind that kept you full for most of a day, with a small amount of dried fruit stirred through it. It was not much, but it was something. When he woke, she gave it to him. He came back to consciousness the way people do after high fevers, slowly and in pieces, awareness assembling itself from scattered parts like someone fitting together a broken plate. His eyes, when they opened, were the color of storm clouds, gray with something darker moving through them, and they focused on the ceiling of her cabin first, then on the fire, then on her. Lena was sitting cross-legged on the floor 3 feet from the pallet, and she met his gaze with the direct, uncomplicated steadiness of someone who has already made all the difficult decisions and is now simply present in the aftermath. She held out the bowl. "It is not much," she said, "but it is hot, and you need to eat. Something before you try to move. Your fever broke about an hour ago. The wound in your side is bound and should hold if you are careful, but you will need a proper healer within the next day or 2. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at the bowl. Then he looked back at her, and something shifted in his expression. Something she could not fully read, a kind of careful stillness that felt like the surface of very deep water. He took the bowl. He ate slowly, which told her he had enough self-awareness to know his body's limits, and he watched her while he did it, not with suspicion exactly, but with the alert, assessing attention of someone who was accustomed to reading rooms and people, and was currently trying to read her. She let him look. She had nothing to hide and was too tired to perform anything. "You brought me in from the snow," he said. It was not a question. "You would have been dead by morning," she said. "That was your last food." She looked at him steadily. Yes. Why? It was such a simple question, and she could see that he was asking it with genuine puzzlement, not as a formality, not as a prelude to something else, but because he actually wanted to understand. She thought about it for a moment, not because the answer was complicated, but because she wanted to give him the real one, rather than the easy one. "Because you were there," she said finally, "and I could." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the storm had settled into the soft, steady snowfall that comes after the violence passes, and the light coming through her small window had the particular blue-white quality of early morning reflected off deep snow. "I am Caden," he said. No clan name, no title. Just the single word, offered with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing exactly how much to give. "Lena," she said, "you do not have to tell me anything else. Not who attacked you, not where you are from, not where you are going. It is none of my business, and I am not asking." Something moved across his face that she would think about later, much later, when she had context to understand it. At the time, she simply registered it as surprise, the genuine kind that a person cannot quite control. "Most people would ask," he said. "Most people are looking for something when they help someone," she said without judgment, simply as a statement of observed fact. "I am not looking for anything. I helped you because it was the right thing to do. That is the whole of it." He finished the porridge. She took the bowl back, rinsed it with a small amount of the water she had left, and set it on the shelf. She found him an extra blanket she had folded at the bottom of her single chest of possessions. She told him that the village had a supply cart coming in 2 days, and that the driver sometimes carried messages to Vorith if paid. So if he needed to contact anyone, he should plan for that timeline. She told him that she would be out most of the day doing her washing work, but that the fire would hold if he kept it banked, and that there was a small amount of dried meat on the shelf that was genuinely his, if he needed it. Then she picked up her washing bundle, said goodbye in the same even tone she might use with a neighbor, and left for work. She did not ask him to be there when she came back. He was. And that, though she did not know it yet, was the beginning of everything. If you are already feeling something, go ahead and drop a comment below, telling me what emotion hit you hardest in this first chapter, because I want to know, and also because the algorithm loves when you engage, and that is how we keep bringing you stories like this one. Now let us continue, because what happens next changes everything. Caden Aldrich Voss, 41st in the line of Voss kings, and the first to hold the title of unified Alpha King across all 5 clans, had not been lost in that snow by accident. He had been in the Stoneback region, specifically because of a report, delivered through a private channel he trusted with his life, suggesting that the grain allocation records for the Northern Territories had been systematically falsified for at least 3 years. The numbers submitted to the Crown showed full distribution to all registered settlements. The actual distribution, according to the source, went only to settlements with direct clan affiliations, leaving unaffiliated villages like Ashvale without their legal share of the allocation, while the official records showed they had received it. Someone was diverting the surplus, and had been doing so long enough to build a significant operation. He had gone personally because he trusted no one else to do it correctly. His council was aware of a diplomatic tour of the Northern Territories. His head of security knew only that he had taken a private route and would rejoin the official party in Voreth in 4 days. No one knew he was specifically investigating the allocation records, because the person he suspected of orchestrating the falsification sat on his inner council and had access to his communications. The ambush had come on the 2nd day, on a mountain path that was not on any public map, which told him immediately that whoever had ordered it had access to his private itinerary. 3 attackers, skilled enough to have been trained rather than hired at random, who had known exactly which route he would take. He had accounted for 2 of them, before the 3rd put a blade in his side and the blood loss and cold had done the rest, carrying him to the edge of consciousness in the snow, until some stubbornly persistent instinct for survival, had kept his wolf from letting go completely, until a small woman with an iron poker and absolutely no fear had appeared out of the dark and started dragging him toward firelight. He had assessed her while she worked on his wound, the parts of his brain that remained functional beneath the fever, cataloging details with the automatic efficiency of a man who had spent 20 years learning to read people quickly. Her hands were calloused and competent. Her cabin was very small and extremely well organized, the kind of organization that comes from having very little and needing to know exactly where everything is. The medicine shelf was more sophisticated than he would have expected from a village this size, which told him either that she had medical training or that she had learned through necessity. The way she worked on him, without hesitation, without squeamishness, without the particular tension of someone performing an act of charity for an audience, told him that helping people was not a performance for her. It was simply what she did. He had been helped by many people in his life. Most of them had wanted something, which was reasonable and understandable, and which he had come to accept as simply the nature of things. His title, his power, his favor, his protection, his gratitude expressed in useful currency. There was always a ledger. Even when people were kind, the ledger existed underneath the kindness. She had no ledger. He had looked for it. The small tell that would reveal calculation beneath generosity. The moment when her eyes would sharpen with the awareness of what he might be worth to her. It did not come. When she gave him the bowl of porridge, the last food she had, and he understood from the way she did not look at the shelf that it was, genuinely the last. There had been nothing in her face but the tired pragmatism of someone who had decided that feeding him was simply the correct thing to do. Why? He had asked, and she had told him the truth so plainly that it had moved through his chest like something physical. Because you were there, and I could. He had given her the smallest piece of himself that he could offer without lying. His given name, no title, no clan marker. He had expected some flicker of recognition. She was too well organized, too observant, too clearly intelligent to be entirely unaware of the wider world. But her eyes had held nothing but the same steady, direct regard she had given him from the moment he opened his eyes. the look of a person who was seeing him as a person, and nothing more complicated than that. He stayed the day because he needed to, his body making the argument his pride would have refused. He slept for most of it, the deep, dreamless sleep of genuine recovery, and when he woke, in the late afternoon to the sound of the door opening, and Lena returning with her laundry bundles and her quiet efficiency, and a small paper-wrapped package of something from the market that she had apparently purchased with whatever spare coin she had, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Safe. Not in the way that palaces and guards and stone walls provided safety, in the way that a fire in a small room provides safety, the particular warmth of being somewhere that is genuinely yours, where you are not being watched or assessed or managed, where the person across from you wants nothing from you except that you should be well. He should have left the next morning. He knew it. His security team would be managing his absence carefully, but every day he was unreachable, increased the risk of something escalating in ways he could not control from a healer's pallet in an unmapped village. He had enemies who were actively trying to kill him. He had a council traitor to identify and a corruption investigation to pursue. He was the king of 5 clans, and he was lying on an Omega's sleeping pallet eating dried meat that she had told him was his. He left on the 3rd morning, before she woke, because he did not trust himself to say goodbye correctly, if she was looking at him with that particular quality of attention that made him feel, uncomfortably and specifically, like a person rather than a king. He left a small square of folded cloth on her medicine shelf, inside which he had placed every piece of coin he had carried in his inner pockets, considerably more than she probably expected. He did not leave a note because he did not know what to write that would be honest without being dangerous. He walked out into the early cold and did not look back, because if he looked back, he was reasonably certain he would turn around, and he had a kingdom to hold together, and a traitor to catch, and an entire life built around the understanding that duty came before everything else. His wolf disagreed. His wolf had been disagreeing, loudly and insistently, since approximately the moment he had opened his eyes and seen her sitting on the floor, calm and tired and real, in a way that nothing in his life had prepared him for. The scent impression had sealed itself while he slept, which was how these things worked. The old magic of the bond, older than any clan law or royal decree, that chose its own moment and asked no one's permission. He had heard of soul impressions the way everyone in the 5 clans had heard of them, as legend, as the kind of thing that happened in old stories rather than in the lives of actual people, more powerful than a standard mate bond, formed not through biology, but through a moment of absolute authentic recognition between 2 souls. He had not expected it to happen to him. He had especially not expected it to happen in a half-frozen 1-room cabin in an unmapped village, while he was barely conscious and being kept alive by a woman who had given him her last meal without asking for anything in return. His wolf had decided. His wolf had decided with a certainty that left no room for argument, the way his wolf always made decisions, completely and without consultation. Caden walked through the snow and felt the impression settle into his chest like a coal, warm and permanent and absolutely insistent, and thought, with the very specific exhaustion of a man who had been managing impossible things for 2 decades, that he needed to deal with the traitor on his council before he could deal with anything else. He thought about her plain, direct voice saying, "Because you were there, and I could," approximately 47 times before he reached the mountain road where his security contact was waiting with a horse in a very carefully controlled expression that communicated, in the precise language of a professional who had served the king for 15 years, that there would be no questions asked, but the relief was considerable. "The others?" Caden asked, mounting despite the pull of his wound. 2 recovered. The 3rd escaped. His guard paused. "Sire." "The trail leads back toward Vorith." Caden looked at the mountain road ahead of them, at the gray sky and the white ground, and the distance between here and the palace where his council was waiting with their careful faces and their hidden ledgers. "Then we follow it," he said. Lena found the cloth on the medicine shelf when she woke, and she sat with it in her hand for a long moment before she opened it. When she counted the coins inside, She sat for considerably longer. It was enough to cover 3 months of rent. It was more money than she had held at one time in the 6 years she had lived in Asheville. It was, she realized with a particular clarity, exactly what someone would leave if they wanted to repay a debt without creating one. A calculated generosity that matched the debt precisely enough to close the ledger without opening a new one. She thought about the man named Caden. She thought about the fever and the wound and the way he had said the word counsel like it tasted of iron. She thought about the quality of his clothing, good fabric, well made. Not the clothing of a wealthy merchant, but of someone for whom quality was simply what surrounded them, and they did not think about it. She thought about his hands, which had the particular blend of callous patterns that came from both weapon training and paperwork, the hands of someone who fought and also governed. She thought about all of these things, and then she thought, carefully and specifically, that she hoped he was safe, wherever he had gone, and that whoever had put a blade in his side was dealt with appropriately, and that if his path ever brought him back through this mountain pass, she would offer him tea without making anything complicated about it. Then she put the coins in the box under the floorboard, where she kept her savings, and went to work, because rent was due, and the herbs were not going to collect themselves. She did not expect to see him again. She was wrong about that, too. The soldiers arrived 11 days after he left, which was long enough that Lena had stopped looking at the mountain road with any particular attention and had returned to the full absorption of ordinary survival. There were 4 of them, in the dark gray cloaks of the Unified Crown Guard, which Lena recognized because she had seen them once, when the Crown's tax collector had come through Asheville 3 years ago, and the sight of that gray had lodged itself in her memory as a reliable indicator that something bureaucratic and unwelcome was about to happen. She was in the wash house when they found her, her arms deep in hot water and a considerable amount of suds, and she looked at them with the particular calm of someone who has learned that showing fear to authority rarely improves the situation. Lena Ashwood, the lead soldier, said, "Yes," she said, without taking her arms out of the water, because the linen was not going to wash itself. "You are requested at the Palace of Black Stone," he said, and then paused, as if he had expected her to react more strongly to this information. "Requested," she said, with careful attention to the specific word. "By personal invitation of the king," he said. Lena finished the section of linen she was working on, removed her arms from the water, dried them on the cloth at her waist, and looked at the lead soldier with the expression of someone doing rapid and complex calculations. "The man I helped 11 days ago," she said. "I am not at liberty to confirm the specifics of the invitation's origin," the soldier said, with the particular phrasing of someone who was technically following orders about discretion while being absolutely transparent about the actual situation. "I see," she said. She looked at the remaining washing in the tub. She looked at the soldiers. She thought about the quality of those clothes and the callous patterns on those hands and the way he had said counsel. And she thought, with a sense of inevitability that was almost funny, that she should have paid more attention to those details. "I need to arrange for my work commitments," she said, "and to leave a message for my landlord. I will need 1 hour." The lead soldier blinked. He had clearly expected more resistance, or more awe, or possibly both. "Of course," he said. She spent the white hour finishing the washing, because the families who had paid her deserved that, leaving the folded linens where their owners would collect them, informing her 3 regular clients via written notes delivered by the market boy that she would be unavailable for the next unknown period of time, paying Elder Marin 2 weeks of rent from the money that Caden had left, and packing a small bag with her practical clothing and her medicine kit and the dried herbs she did not want to leave to go bad. She did not pack anything to impress anyone, because she did not own anything that would accomplish that, and also because the idea of trying to manage how a king perceived her seemed both exhausting and beside the point. The soldiers had brought a horse for her, which was considerate, and a carriage that she politely declined in favor of the horse, because 4 days in a carriage with 4 strangers sounded significantly worse than 4 days on horseback. The lead soldier looked at her for a moment, and then said, with what seemed like genuine warmth, that the king had said she would probably say something like that. Lena looked at the mountain road ahead of her and felt the particular sensation of a life about to change in ways she did not yet have the information to understand. She followed the soldiers north toward the Palace of Black Stone, and she took with her exactly what she had always had: her hands, her knowledge, her plain-speaking directness, and the deep, quiet certainty that she owed no one a performance of someone she was not. Leave a comment right now telling me what you think she is going to say when she sees him again, because this reunion is going to be unlike anything you have ever seen in a supernatural romance story. I promise you that. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is genuinely the time, because we are only getting started. The Palace of Black Stone was exactly what its name suggested, constructed from the dark volcanic rock of the high Stoneback Range, which absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and gave the palace the particular quality of looking simultaneously enormous and deeply present, as though it had grown from the mountain rather than been built upon it. Lena had seen drawings of it in a book she had borrowed from the Vorith library on one of her supply trips, but the drawings had not conveyed the way it sat against the sky, commanding and permanent, with none of the decorative excess she had expected from a royal seat. She was taken through a side entrance rather than the main gates, which she appreciated because it meant fewer people looking at her travel clothes and her practical bag, and led through a series of hallways that were impressive without being aggressive about it. Stone walls hung with tapestries that showed maps rather than battles, which she found interesting, into a sitting room that had a fire and chairs and a window, overlooking an interior courtyard where snow was just beginning to fall. She was left there with tea, which was excellent, and a plate of food that was considerably more elaborate than anything she had eaten recently, and the information that the king would attend her when his current meeting concluded. Lena drank the tea and ate a reasonable amount of the food, and looked out the window at the courtyard, and organized her thoughts with the same methodical calm she brought to difficult herb collections in uncertain weather. She did not know what was coming. She could not prepare for something she did not have sufficient information about. Therefore, she would be present, direct, and herself, because those were the only tools she reliably had. When the door opened, she did not stand up immediately, because she was in the middle of a thought, and when she finished the thought, she looked up, and there he was. He was considerably more himself than he had been in her cabin, which was to say that the fever and the snow and the blood had been replaced by clean clothes and recovered health and the particular upright bearing of a person who carries authority the way most people carry their own bones, so much a part of them that they have stopped being aware of it. He was also considerably more obviously powerful, because context was doing the work that his plain dark traveling cloak had prevented, and the context was unmistakable. He looked at her with the same quality of attention he had brought to her cabin, the alert, assessing stillness that she had noticed the first time, except that now it was accompanied by something else, a warmth underneath the assessment that he was not quite successfully concealing. "You are sitting down," he said. "I was finishing a thought," she said. "Hello, Caden." Something moved across his face. She would later understand that it was the particular sensation of hearing your name spoken by someone who knows nothing of your title and is therefore speaking to the actual person beneath it, which is a thing that happens very rarely when you are the king of 5 clans, and which produces every time an involuntary internal disruption. "Hello, Lena," he said. He sat across from her, in the other chair by the fire, without the ceremony that she would later learn usually surrounded him, and she thought that this was probably intentional, a deliberate choice to be in this room the way they had been in her cabin, 2 people having a conversation, the rest of it set aside for later. "You know who I am," he said. "I worked it out," she said. "The clothes, your hands, the way you said, counsel, the amount of money you left, which was very precisely calculated to close a debt rather than create an obligation, which is a specific kind of financial literacy that suggests you have thought carefully about the politics of generosity." She paused. "Also, your soldiers were not subtle." His mouth moved in what would have been a smile if he had let it finish. "I told them to be discreet. They were discreet about the specifics," she said fairly. Less so about the general situation. He looked at her for a moment. You are not frightened. Of you specifically, or of the situation generally? Either. She considered this. The situation is unfamiliar, she said, and I do not have enough information yet to know whether it will turn out to be a problem. But you specifically, no. You are the same person who was in my cabin, just with more context around you. Most people find the context significant. Most people experience the context before they experience the person, she said. I had it the other way around. He was quiet for a moment, and she had the impression of something settling in him, some held tension releasing slightly, the way a person breathes differently when they realize they do not have to maintain a particular performance. I brought you here because there are things you need to know, he said, things that affect you directly, and that I did not have the means to tell you safely before I left. About who attacked you, she said. Partially, but also about you. He paused. What do you know about your bloodline, Lena? She looked at him steadily. I know that my parents died when I was 14. I know that I was told I was an unaffiliated Omega, that there was no clan record of my family going back more than 2 generations, and that this was the reason I could not register for clan protections. She paused. I know that the people who told me, these things may not have had complete information, or may have had reasons to give me incomplete information. I have suspected this for some time. I did not know what to do with the suspicion. Something shifted in his expression, and this time she could read it. The specific quality of a person who has prepared for a difficult conversation and has just discovered that the other party is already most of the way there. Your family name, he said carefully, was not originally Ashwood. She waited. Your grandmother, he said, was a woman named Sarah Voss. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Lena sat with this information for a moment, turned it over, examined it from several angles. Voss, she said, as in your family name. As in my family's name, he confirmed. She was my grandfather's younger sister. She presented as an Omega at 17, which at that time was considered a significant problem for the royal line, as Omega royals were seen as liabilities, rather than assets in the marriage politics of the era. She was quietly removed from the succession records and given a new name and resettled in the Southern Territories. She was told that if she maintained the new identity and raised her children without reference to the bloodline, her descendants would be left in peace. And were they? For 2 generations, yes. Your mother's generation was when things became complicated. He paused. There are people on my council who have known about your existence for some time. People who have very specific reasons to want to ensure that no one with Voss blood outside the main line ever becomes significant enough to make a claim. Lena thought about the grain allocation records that were not reaching Ashvale. She thought about the deliberate unmapping of Omega villages. She thought about the attack in the mountains, and the blade in his side, and the soldier who had said the trail leads back toward Vorith. They were not only trying to kill you, she said slowly. No, he said. The original plan, as far as we have been able to reconstruct it, was to kill me, and then ensure that the succession went to a candidate they controlled. The discovery that you existed, and that you had settled near the Stoneback region, was apparently recent enough that the plan had to be adjusted. What does that mean for me? It means that you are not safe in Ashvale, he said directly. It means that the people who tried to kill me know your name and your location. And it means that whether you want it or not, you are now involved in something considerably larger than either of us would have chosen. Lena looked at the fire for a moment. And the other thing, she said. You said there were 2 things. My bloodline, and what affects me directly. Is there a second thing? He looked at her with the stillness that she was beginning to understand was what his face did when he was being careful. The white flame, he said. She felt something move in her chest at the words, which was interesting because she had never heard them before and had no reason to feel anything at the sound of them. Tell me, she said. The white flame was the name given, in the oldest records of the 5 clans, to a hereditary ability that had appeared in the Voss line approximately every 4 or 5 generations, and had last manifested 200 years ago in a woman named Aleth, who had used it to end a civil war by walking into a council chamber where both sides had gathered for what was supposed to be a battle and simply making it impossible for anyone in the room to maintain a lie. The ability, as the records described it, had 3 aspects. The first was healing, not the slow biological healing that all werewolves possessed to some degree, but something more direct. The capacity to close wounds and reduce fever and ease pain through touch, which explained why Lena's hands had always run warmer than other people's, and why the herbs she dried seemed to retain potency longer than they should, and why the few times she had held the hands of seriously ill people in her village, they had sometimes seemed to improve beyond what the medicine alone could account for. The second aspect was truth revelation. The white flame, when actively directed, created a field in which deception became physiologically difficult, not impossible, but painful enough and obvious enough that the ability to maintain sustained, deliberate lies became extremely compromised. Aleth had used this to expose 2 decades of fabricated battle reports in a 15-minute council session, at which point both sides of the Civil War had been confronted with so many lies simultaneously unraveling that the political will to continue fighting had simply collapsed. The third aspect, the rarest and most dangerous, was bond breaking. The white flame could sever forced mate bonds, the kind that had been imposed without consent, which had been done throughout the history of the 5 clans as a method of political control, and which continued to be done in regions where local alphas maintained enough power to act outside royal law. A forced bond was one of the most damaging things that could happen to an Omega, a psychic tether that could be used to compel obedience and suppress autonomous decision-making, and the ability to break them had been lost with Aleth, and had been, not coincidentally, deeply inconvenient to the systems of power that relied on the impossibility of escape. Lena listened to all of this with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, which was total and direct and without performance. "This is why my hands are warm," she said. "It is a significant part of why your hands are warm," he said. "And you know I have it because your grandmother's records, which we only recently located in the suppressed archive, contained a notation from the royal physician at the time of her assessment. He wrote that she showed preliminary indicators of the white flame, which was one of the reasons, possibly the primary reason, that she was removed from the royal household, rather than simply removed from the succession." He paused. "Because an Omega with the white flame was not a liability. She was a threat." Lena thought about 14 years of surviving on the edges of systems that had been very carefully designed to make survival difficult. She thought about the grain allocation numbers that did not reach Ashvale. She thought about the unmapped villages and the higher taxes, and the legal prohibition on property ownership, and the 1,000 small structural mechanisms that kept unaffiliated Omegas exactly where people with power needed them to be, invisible, scrambling, and without the resources to ask questions. "Someone suppressed this ability on purpose," she said. "Not just hid my grandmother. Built systems around ensuring that Omegas specifically could never accumulate the safety or stability, or political access that would allow someone like me to discover what I carry." "Yes," he said, simply and directly. "And you knew about these systems." A pause. She appreciated that he did not attempt to deflect it. "I knew about some of them," he said. "I did not know the full extent. The grain allocation investigation was my attempt to begin understanding what I had been told was managed versus what was actually happening. I was beginning to understand that the gap was larger than I had believed." Another pause. Careful and honest. "I am still learning the size of the gap. I expect it will continue to be uncomfortable." She looked at him. "That is a more honest answer than I expected. You have not given me a reason to be anything but honest with you," he said, "and I find that I prefer it." She thought about this. She thought about the bowl of porridge and the closed debt, and the name without a title. She thought about a man who ran his own intelligence operations, specifically because he did not trust his counsel to give him unfiltered information, and what that said about the structure he had inherited and the structure he was trying to build. "What do you want from me?" she asked directly. Not what the situation requires, not what the bloodline means politically. What do you, specifically, want? He was quiet for a moment that felt genuine rather than strategic. "I want you to be safe," he said. "I want the people who tried to use your existence as a tool in a succession scheme to be held accountable. I want to understand what the white flame is, and what it means that it has reappeared, because I think it means something about the moment we are in as much as it means something about you." He paused. "And I want to know you. I am aware that is a complicated thing to say given the circumstances." "It is," she agreed, "but it is the most honest thing you have said. So I appreciate it." She looked at the fire for a moment. "I will tell you what. I want to understand what I am. I want the people responsible for my village, not receiving its grain allocation, to be specifically accountable. Not in a general reform that papers over the individuals who made the decision, but specifically accountable. I want the Omega villages in the Northern Territories to be put on the official map, with full allocation rights and clan protection access. And I want to go back to Ashvale when this is finished." He looked at her. "You do not want a title," he said. "I want my people to have food," she said. "A title without that is decoration. Reformation with that is meaningful." A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that forms when two people have said something real to each other and are both sitting with it. "Then we are agreed on what matters," he said. "We are agreed on the first layer." She corrected gently. "There will be more layers. There always are." His mouth did the thing that would have been a smile if he had let it finish, and this time he let it finish. She thought, with a careful internal honesty she was practiced at maintaining, that he had a very good smile, and that this was information she would store and not immediately act on, because she was in a palace she had never seen before in a situation she did not yet fully understand, and she had not survived 6 years in Ashvale by acting on incomplete information. But she stored it. The next 3 weeks were the most education Lena had received in any 3-week period of her life, which was saying something given that she had taught herself herb medicine, wound care, washing chemistry, and rudimentary financial management entirely through necessity and observation. She was given a room that was larger than her entire cabin, which she found slightly ridiculous, but decided not to comment on, because it had a good fire and a genuinely excellent window. She was given access to the palace library, which was the single thing that made her feel that the universe might have been, despite everything, somewhat on her side, because the library was vast and well organized, and contained not only the official histories of the 5 clans, but also the suppressed archive section that Caden had mentioned, which was now officially unsuppressed, and which she spent approximately 30% of her waking hours in. She met Rovan, the head archivist, a beta woman of around 60 with reading spectacles, and the particular energy of a person who has spent 40 years in a library and is completely at peace with this decision. Rovan had been waiting, she said, with characteristic archival directness, for someone to actually read the Voss Omega files with the specific intent of understanding them rather than managing them, and she proceeded to make herself available to Lena for approximately 6 hours a day, with a thoroughness that Lena found deeply refreshing. She met Devon, who turned out to be not the enemy she had half expected from Caden's feverish mention of the name, but Caden's head of security, a tall alpha woman with a scar across her jaw, and the measured manner of someone who had been protecting a high-value person for a very long time, and had the wariness that comes with it. Devon assessed Lena in their first meeting with the comprehensive efficiency of someone checking for vulnerabilities in a defensive line, and then, apparently satisfied with whatever she found, proceeded to be straightforwardly helpful for the duration of Lena's stay, in a way that was professional and genuine, without being warm. She met the council members, formally and in the context of a presentation that Caden had arranged specifically to make their knowledge of her existence official and documented before anyone could use the element of surprise. There were 7 of them. 4 struck her as people she could work with. 2 struck her as people who were carefully managing something behind their careful faces. 1, a heavy-set alpha man named Counselor Arath, struck her as someone who was afraid of her, which was interesting because she had not done anything yet. She thought about Arath often, in the weeks that followed. She thought about the specific quality of his fear, which was not the fear of someone who has done nothing wrong, and is simply intimidated by a new and powerful element in his environment. It was the fear of someone who has done specific things and is now calculating, how exposed those specific things might be. She did not have the white flame under control yet. What she had, at this stage, was the growing awareness of what it felt like when it was active, a warmth in her palms that she had always experienced but had been unconsciously suppressing. The instinctive management of something she had learned not to show because showing unusual abilities in an Omega village was not safe. Rovin's archive had given her the theoretical framework. What she needed now was practice, and practice required intention. And intention required the kind of security and stability that she had not had in 6 years and was still learning to trust. Caden gave her space. He was careful about it in the way that thoughtful people are careful when they are very aware that their position carries an inherent imbalance of power and are actively attempting not to leverage that imbalance. He met with her daily because there was genuine logistical necessity in the investigation they were both involved in, and in those meetings, he was direct and practical and willing to disagree with her in ways that she found productive. He was also, she observed, learning to disagree with other people more directly on the basis of conversations they had, which was interesting to watch. He brought her into the investigation formally, not as a witness or a subject or a political asset, but as an investigator, which was the right call both tactically and ethically, and which she appreciated without saying so out loud, because she did not want to make it into a moment. He shared what he knew about the grain allocation falsification, the attack in the mountains, and the evidence pointing toward Counselor Aerith as the architect of both. She shared what she had observed about Aerith in their formal meeting, and what Rovin had helped her find in the suppressed archive about previous incidents of falsified allocation records going back 12 years, which predated Aerith's appointment to the council by 2 years and suggested either an accomplice or a predecessor. "There is someone else," she said, on the 8th day, spreading archive documents across the library table with the methodical organization she brought to herb sorting. "Aerith is executing this, but someone designed it. These records have too much consistency over too long a period for it to be one person's improvisation." Caden looked at the documents. He had the quality of concentration of someone who was genuinely engaged rather than performing engagement, and she had noticed that he took what she said seriously without requiring her to defend it from suspicion first, which was not something she had experienced frequently from people in authority, and which she was consciously not becoming too accustomed to, because she was not certain yet whether it was reliable. "The record spans 6 regional administrators," he said, "which means the falsification protocol was passed between them," she said. "Either they were all recruited to the scheme, or the information about how to do it was embedded in the position itself. The handover documents." He looked at her. "The handover documents," he repeated, and she could see him following the thread. If the methodology for falsification was written into the official administrative handover procedures for the Northern Allocation Office, then every incoming administrator would have simply continued it as standard practice, making it invisible, she said. "You do not need to recruit someone to a conspiracy if they believe what they are doing is the established procedure." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "This is significantly larger than I thought." "Yes," she said. "I suspect that will continue to be true." He looked at her with the expression that she had learned to recognize as the one he wore when he was adjusting his internal model of a situation, and was doing it honestly rather than defensively. "How are you this calm?" "About it?" he asked. "I have known for 6 years that the systems were broken in ways that people at the top were not acknowledging," she said. "Finding documentation of it is confirmation, not discovery. The emotion has had a long time to settle." "What I mean," he said more carefully, "is how are you this calm, given that the documentation is also documentation of what was done to your family, your grandmother, your mother?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because being angry about it does not stop being appropriate just because I am also calm about it," she said finally. "Both can be true. I can understand the system and be furious at what it did to the people I came from at the same time. I have been doing that for 6 years as well." She paused. "And because I think the anger is most useful when it is pointing somewhere specific and producing something, Right now it is pointing at the handover documents. He nodded slowly. Right, the handover documents. They found the corrupted administrative protocol on the 10th day, embedded in a 12-year-old document written by a former regional administrator named Pelek, who had died 6 years ago under circumstances that the official record described as illness, and the suppressed archive suggested were somewhat more complicated. Pelek was also the name mentioned twice in Areth's private correspondence that Davin's team had intercepted 3 days into the investigation, which connected the conspiracy's origin to its current executor and closed the loop in a way that was legally sufficient. Areth was not the architect. Pelek had been. But Areth had known, for the full 12 years of his council service, had inherited the falsification protocol and continued it and expanded it, and had added, in the past 3 years, the specific clause that removed the unaffiliated Omega Village register from the allocation calculations entirely. Lena looked at this clause for a long time when Rovan showed it to her. A single sentence in administrative language, dry and bureaucratic and specific, which had resulted in approximately 200 people in Ashvale and an estimated 3,000 people in similar villages across the Northern Territories, going without their legal food allocation for 3 years. She thought about old Marin, with the roof she never fixed, because she did not have the money. She thought about the market that operated 3 days a week, selling rejected goods. She thought about the calculation she did at the end of every month. What could be stretched, and what could be skipped. The arithmetic of not quite enough. She thought about the children in Ashvale, the specific 4 or 5 she knew, small and quiet and too wise for their ages, who ate what their parents could manage to provide. Her hands were very warm. I need to practice, she told Rovan. Rovan looked at her with the eyes of a woman who had read the archive and understood exactly what she was referring to. The South Courtyard, Rovan said, is private and covered, and I have already told the guards that it is reserved for personal study for the foreseeable future. Lena looked at her. You were expecting this, she said. I have been waiting for someone with the white flame for quite some time, Rovan said, with the particular tranquility of a person who has been patient about something for long enough that patience has become comfortable. I thought it would be useful to be prepared. Comment below if you felt that moment, because I did. I am telling you right now. And we are heading into the most intense part of this story. So if you are not subscribed yet, please, you will not want to miss what comes next. Lena practiced the white flame for 5 days in the South Courtyard, alone, and then with Rovan observing, and on the 6th day with Caden present because he had asked to understand it, and she had decided that she trusted his reasons. The practice was not what she had imagined it would be, which she had half expected, because most things were not what she imagined them to be. She had imagined something externally dramatic, fire or light or some visible transformation. What it was instead was more like learning to stop suppressing something that her body already knew how to do, like the difference between holding your breath and breathing. The warmth in her palms was always there. The practice was in letting it move, directing it rather than containing it, understanding the difference between the healing aspect and the truth-revealing aspect and the bond-breaking aspect, each of which had a different quality in her hands, a different texture of heat. Healing was the most immediate. She had been doing it all along, she understood now. With every person whose hand she had held, every patient she had sat with in Asheville's makeshift healer space in the back of the market building. The difference between doing it unconsciously and doing it consciously was the difference. Between pouring water from a tilted container and actually directing a stream, the latter was more effective by a significant margin and also more controllable. Truth revelation was subtler and more complex. It was not, she discovered, a field she could simply turn on like a light. It required her own honesty as a foundation, which meant she had to be in a state of genuine internal clarity herself for it to function correctly. This was interesting to learn, because it meant the ability could not be weaponized easily by someone who was themselves dishonest. The white flame required the person who carried it to be, functionally, not hiding anything from themselves. She thought about what that meant. She thought about what she was, currently, hiding from herself. She was aware that she had feelings about Caden that she had been categorizing as information in progress rather than feelings, because feelings required action or decision, and she had been too busy surviving and investigating and learning to be the person she apparently actually was to have space for feelings. She was aware that these feelings were not mild. She was aware that she had, approximately 47 times, noticed specific things about him and filed them under a category she was calling relevant data that upon honest examination was not a data category at all. She admitted this to herself on the 4th day of practice, in the cold quiet of the south courtyard, with the snow falling outside the covered walkway and her hands warm against the winter air, because the white flame showed her, with the particular unkindness of a very clear mirror, that she could not hide from herself and expect it to function. She was falling in love with him. She had been, she suspected, since the moment he had looked at her across her cabin with that careful stillness, and taken the bowl she offered him without performing gratitude. She had been since he said his name like a small piece of trust. She had been since he left the coins that closed the debt exactly and walked away, which was the act of a person who had thought carefully about what she needed versus what would make him feel better. She filed this information in an honest internal location and returned to practice, because love was information too, and she would deal with it as she had dealt with everything else, by understanding it clearly and then deciding what to do. On the 6th day, when Caden watched her practice the truth-revealing aspect, in a simple controlled exercise with Rovan, she saw his face while he watched her, and she understood, with the particular clarity of the white flame combined with her own honest attention, that he was in the same position she was. Aware, careful, choosing not to act on incomplete information, waiting. As she was waiting, for a moment that felt less complicated, she decided that evening that they had been waiting for a moment that was less complicated long enough. She found him in the library, where he went in the evenings to read reports in the marginally more comfortable setting that the library provided over his formal office. He looked up when she came in, and she sat down across from him in the other chair by the fire, which had become, she realized, the position of their honest conversations. And she said, without preamble, "I want to be clear about something before we proceed with the rest of the situation." He set down the report. He gave her his full attention, which she had, noticed he did, genuinely, as a matter of course. "I am aware," she said, "that you are the king, and that I am a person who was living in a one-room cabin in an unmapped village 11 days before I arrived here, and that the gap between those two situations is considerable. I am also aware of the soul impression, because Rovan's archive has extensive documentation of it, and because I can feel it, which I should probably have mentioned earlier but was processing." She paused. "I want to say that neither of those things is the reason I am here saying this. The soul impression is a biological fact, not a decision. The title is a circumstance, not a person. What I am here to say is about the person." He was very still. "The person," she said, "who took the bowl of porridge without making it into something other than what it was, who left coins that closed a debt rather than opened an obligation, who told me his given name and nothing else, who has, in the weeks since, been consistently honest with me in ways that I understand cost him something, because honesty costs people in his position considerably, who disagrees with me when he thinks I am wrong, and takes it seriously when I disagree with him, who has not, at any point, attempted to use the considerable number of advantages he has over me to move this in a direction I have not chosen." She looked at him steadily. "I am choosing," she said, "not because of the impression, not because of the circumstances, because of you specifically. And I wanted to say it clearly, because I think both of us have been waiting for someone to say it clearly, and I am better at saying things clearly than I am at waiting." The fire crackled. The snow fell outside. He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something open and unguarded in a way that she suspected was very rare. "I have been," he said carefully, "thinking about how to say something for approximately 12 days. How was it going?" "Not well," he admitted. "I kept finding reasons to wait for a better moment. "There is not a better moment," she said. "There is this one." He reached across and took her hand, which was warm, and held it with a simplicity and directness that matched everything else he did that she valued. No performance, no grand gesture, just the clear and honest act of choosing contact. "Lena," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know. I have not finished. I know," is still the answer. She said. But yes. His mouth did the thing that became a smile completely, fully, without reservation. And she thought, with the particular satisfaction of a person whose honest assessment has been proven correct, that it was every bit as good as she had filed it as being. The trial of Counselor Erath was set for the first week of the new month, and it was Caden's intention to make it formal, documented, and public, which was politically complicated but ethically straightforward, and which, Lena had argued for specifically on the grounds that accountability without public witness was accountability that could be quietly revised later. She had not argued for her own role in the trial. That had been Caden's suggestion, and then Davon's specific tactical recommendation, and then Rovin's archival endorsement. And by the time all three had made the case, she had concluded that the logic was sound, even if the prospect of using the white flame in a formal council setting made her hands feel like she had dipped them in moving water. The council chamber of the Palace of Black Stone was a circular room with high ceilings and stone walls hung with the banners of all 5 clans, which was an architectural choice that Lena had identified as intentional and symbolic. No clan at the head, all represented equally, which was either a genuine statement of values or a performance of one, and which, after 3 weeks in this palace, she was beginning to believe was the former. The chamber held 12 seats, 7 for the council, 4 for regional representatives who rotated quarterly, and 1, at the center rather than the head, for the king, which was also, she noted, an intentional choice. There were additional witnesses, given the specific nature of the proceeding. Regional administrators, 2 judges from the Crown's legal body, the heads of 3 of the 5 clan packs, and, in the observer section, Rovin and Devon, and 6 others who Lena had come to know over the past 3 weeks as people who were in this palace because they were trying to make it function more honestly. Erath was present, seated, and had the particular quality of a man who has calculated his odds and found them poor, but has not yet decided whether to capitulate or fight. Caden presented the evidence first, which he did with the precise, organized directness she had observed in their investigation sessions. The falsified records, the corrupted handover protocol, the intercepted correspondence, the 12-year timeline of allocation diversion. He presented it as a set of facts rather than an accusation, which was more devastating than an accusation would have been, because it left no room for the response of, "This is interpretation," or "This is political motivation." It was documentation. Erath's advocate attempted to challenge several points, with the limited success of someone working with inadequate material. Then Caden said simply, "I would ask Lena Ashwood to speak." She stood from the witness chair and walked to the center of the room, and she was aware of the particular quality of attention that the chamber directed at her, the weight of it, the calculation in some faces and the curiosity in others, and the fear, very specifically, in Erath's. She had decided in the end not to use the truth-revealing aspect first. She had decided to say what was true herself, from her own experience, because she thought that was more powerful than anything the white flame could demonstrate. "My name is Lena Ashwood," she said, in the even, carrying voice she had developed over years of speaking in spaces that were not designed for her to be heard. "I lived for 6 years in the village of Ashvale, in the Northern Territory, which is not on any official map of the 5 clans, and which did not receive its legal grain allocation for 3 years, which is the period during which Counselor Erath held direct oversight of the Northern Allocation Office. I paid higher taxes than any clan-registered resident, because I was classified as unaffiliated. I was legally prohibited from purchasing property. The clinic in Ashvale had no official healer, because no healer was eligible for crown funding to serve an unregistered settlement. In the winter of 3 years ago, a child in Ashvale died of a fever that a properly stocked medicine cabinet could have treated. Her name was Essa. She was 7 years old. The chamber was very quiet. "I am not here," she said, "to describe suffering for emotional effect. I am here because this chamber is the appropriate place to name what was done and to whom, and because the documentation that has been presented today represents not an administrative failure, but a deliberate choice, made over 12 years and passed between administrators as standard practice, to ensure that people without clan standing would receive nothing they were legally owed, while the records showed that they had. I am here to ask that this chamber understand not only that Councillor Aerith continued and expanded this practice, but that the practice was designed by someone, which means it was designed, which means there is an architecture to dismantle and not only an individual to hold accountable." She looked at Aerith. "I am also here," she said quietly, "because I carry something that makes it very difficult for the people in this room to sustain deliberate falsehood." She did not announce it further. She simply let it happen. The warmth moving from her palms outward into the room as she had practiced. The truth-revealing aspect, steady and directed and honest, rooted in her own clarity about what she wanted and why she was here. The effect was not dramatic, which she had expected. It was not fire or light or visible transformation. It was simply that the people in the room who had been maintaining careful separations between what they said and what they knew began to experience those separations as uncomfortable in a way they could not ignore. Aerith broke first, because he had the most to maintain and the least foundation beneath it. He did not confess. He challenged, which was what she had anticipated, standing abruptly and saying, with the agitated force of someone who is used to authority smoothing his way, "This is a manipulation. This is a political plant. She has no standing in this chamber. She is an unaffiliated Omega with a claim to a bloodline no one has verified, and this entire proceeding is designed to." And then he stopped. He stopped because the white flame, when a person pushes deliberately against it with deliberate falsehood in a directed stream, pushes back. And what Aerith felt in that moment was what it felt like to be unable to maintain a lie he had been carrying for 12 years. "She has standing in this chamber," he said, in a very different voice. "She has the standing she was never supposed to have." The room was absolutely silent. "There are names," he said with the flat exhaustion of someone who has just put down something very heavy. "There are other names. I will give them. I will give all of them." And he did. The aftermath of a reckoning is not dramatic. It does not feel like triumph, which is one of the things that surprised Lena, though perhaps it should not have. It felt like the particular tiredness of having done something necessary, and arrived at a place where there was space to breathe, but not yet space to rest, because there was still the architecture to dismantle. 7 names in addition to Aerith. 3 of them currently serving in administrative positions. 2 in the councils of allied pacts. 1 retired but still influential. 1 dead, who had passed the protocol to Pellic 22 years ago. A fact that extended the timeline of the corruption further than anyone had previously known. The legal process was careful, documented, and public, because Lena had argued for publicity at every stage, and Caden had agreed, and the records were now in the public archive rather than the suppressed one. 3 of the 7 were removed from their positions immediately. Accountability had teeth, and the teeth were being used. The Omega Village Register was formally established within 2 weeks. A legal document creating an official register of all unaffiliated settlements, entitling them to the same allocation access and the same clan protection considerations as registered settlements. Ashvale was the first entry. Then, 43 others across the Northern Territories. And when Lena reviewed the list, she recognized names she had heard whispered by travelers at the Ashvale market. Places that existed in the shared knowledge of unaffiliated Omegas, the way unmapped roads exist in the knowledge of people who use them despite their absence from official documents. The Forced Bond Registry, the document that would allow the Crown's legal office to identify and investigate suspected instances of non-consensual bonding and to direct cases toward healers trained in the bond-breaking procedure that the White Flame could perform. This took longer, because there was more structural resistance and because several of the regional pack heads needed significant convincing that the Crown had the legal standing to intervene in what they framed as internal pack matters. Caden held firm on this in a way that Lena observed and appreciated, not because she had asked him to, but because he understood now what she had helped him understand in 12 days of investigation. That internal pack matters had been the administrative cover under which a very large amount of harm had been done. She trained Rovan in the identification of bond-breaking candidates. She wrote a document, with Rovan's archival help, on the theoretical and practical aspects of the white flame for the Crown's medical office, so that when she was not available, the knowledge would still exist. She thought carefully about what she was building versus what she was handing over, and she made decisions about both. She went back to Ashvale. This had always been part of what she wanted, and Caden had known it since she said it in the sitting room with the fire and the excellent tea, and it had not been a point of negotiation between them, but simply a fact, which was one of the reasons it was not difficult to say again, when the work had reached a stage where her presence at the palace had shifted from necessary to useful, but not essential. "I will come back," she said, "regularly. There is still work here that needs the white flame specifically, and there is other work that needs the person I happen to be. But Ashvale is my home, and the people there are my people, and I have commitments I left unfinished." He looked at her across the library chairs and the fire and the comfortable honesty of the space they had built between them over weeks of being genuinely present with each other. "I know," he said. "I also want to visit, if that is acceptable. The accommodation options are limited," she said. "I have slept on your floor before." "You have slept on my pallet while I slept on the floor," she corrected. "Then it is fair for you to sleep on the pallet while I take the floor," he said. "And after that, we are even." She looked at him. "This is not actually a complicated logistical problem, you know." "No," he agreed. And the warmth in his eyes was the specific warmth of someone who is very happy and is being straightforward about it. She went back to Ashvale in early spring, when the mountain road had cleared enough to be reliable, with a formal letter of address that she had not requested but accepted because it was practically useful, and a supply of medical materials for the clinic that was now officially eligible for Crown funding, and the specific knowledge that she could return to the palace when she wanted, and would be welcomed when she did. Elder Marin, when Lena arrived at the village and stopped to pay her rent, looked at the horse and the formal letter and the general fact of Lena's existence, and said, without particular drama, "I suppose you will be wanting the roof fixed. Eventually." Lena said, "It is not actually the priority. Can we talk about the grain allocation process and what the village needs to do to access the new registry?" Marin looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed, which Lena had never heard her do before. "Come in," she said. "I will make tea." Lena came in and drank the tea and got to work. The king's first visit to Ashvale happened 6 weeks after Lena's return, which was long enough that it was not dramatic, but short enough that anyone paying attention could calculate what it meant. He came with a small retinue rather than a formal procession, which she had suggested, and he had agreed to without needing to be asked twice. And he arrived in the early afternoon, when the market was at its midweek busy period and most of the village was out. The village learned that the king was in Ashvale within approximately 4 minutes of his arrival, which was the specific speed at which information moved through Ashvale, which Lena had measured empirically over 6 years. He was, by the time she reached the market square, surrounded by a loose ring of curious villagers at a respectful distance, handling it with the particular composure of a person who is used to being observed, but is not comfortable being observed in casual settings, and is doing his best not to show this. He looked visibly relieved when she appeared. "You are late," he said. "I was finishing something," she said. "You should have sent word of your specific arrival time." "I sent word of my arrival date," he said, with the tone of someone making a reasonable argument. "A date is not a time," she said, and held out her hand, which he took with the simplicity and directness that had become the language of their physical contact. No performance, just honest and present. The village watched this with the contained intensity of people who are processing a significant amount of information simultaneously. Then old Marin, who had worked her way to the front of the loose ring, said to no one in particular, and everyone simultaneously, "Well, I suppose the roof will be fixed after all. Lena felt something in her chest that was large and warm, and not entirely comfortable in the way that large, warm things sometimes are not entirely comfortable when you are not quite used to having them yet, but that she recognized as being exactly where it belonged. She thought about a night in the snow, and a stranger with a fever and a bowl of porridge that was the last thing she had, and the particular arithmetic of that moment. What could be stretched and what could be skipped, and the decision she had made without calculating it at all. She thought about all the decisions since, the ones that were calculated and the ones that were not, the ones that had required every ounce of plain-speaking directness she had, and the ones that had simply been her, present and honest in the moment available. She thought, this is how things change. Not in the grand gesture or the sudden revelation, in the person in the snow who you choose to bring inside, in the last meal you give without counting the cost, in the moment you say yes, clearly and on your own terms, to something real. She held his hand in the market square of Asheville while the snow began to fall again, light and early for the season, and she thought that the archive of her life had, against considerable odds, found its way to a page she was glad to be on. She was also, she noted with the honest practicality that was the bedrock of everything she was, going to need to restock the fever wart before winter. Some things did not change, and she was, quietly and specifically, glad of that too. Thank you so much for being here for this entire story, because it was a long one and a full one. And I am genuinely grateful for every moment you stayed. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what it means to help someone without a ledger, to choose someone not because of what they represent, but because of who they actually are, please leave a like right now, because it helps this channel reach more people who need stories like this one. And if you have a favorite moment, a line or a scene that stayed with you, drop it in the comments. I read every single one and I want to know what landed for you. If you are new here, welcome, and please subscribe, because we have an entire library of supernatural romance stories that go this deep and this honest about power and love and what transformation actually looks like when you strip away the fantasy and keep the truth. And if you have been here for a while, you know that this is what we do. We tell stories about people who choose right action in hard circumstances, and love that is earned rather than given, and we are not going to stop. The next story is already in progress, and I think it might be the most complicated thing we have done yet, so keep notifications on, and I will see you there. Until then, take care of yourself, and remember, you do not need a title to matter. You just need to be there, and to be willing. That is the whole of it.